All right, so we have encryption now. Where do you define authentication? If you look at this screen, there is no authentication manager, but in fact, it's in the SSID manager. So we'll come here to look at the authentication, and we'll come back as well to configure some other schemes. So you have to configure an SSID first, and then I'm going to skip all these default about what VLAN you associate it to, etc. We'll come back on that in the next section, but what I want to focus on is here, this section. So authentication can be done with open authentication, and that's with or without EAP. You have the option to choose EAP. Open without anything else is just open, right? So there is no encryption. And if you choose to do that, you can still use WPA v2 because you'll be deciding on the encryption scheme below. You can add to the open authentication with or without WPA v2 EAP or MAC authentication. Remember, that's weak mechanism. And you can also add to MAC authentication EAP. So you have all the authentication schemes that are going to be defined here. So let's keep it open and check it and try another one. Web authentication, that's pretty obvious, right? That's when you have web authentication on the access point. Shared authentication, so this is a bit special. This is web, right? So you don't want to use it. And you can again use it with MAC authentication or have a sort of EAP and then use dynamic web as a result of your EAP authentication. So that's more robust than web alone, but still, you shouldn't use web today, so let's uncheck that. The last one, network EAP, is also a bit special. That's a specific vocabulary for the autonomous access point. It means LEAP, which is lightweight EAP, which is an older authentication and encryption mechanism that was Cisco proprietary and that was deprecated before EAP fast was introduced. So network EAP equals LEAP. It's there. You can use it with or without MAC authentication, but most likely you don't want to use it. So let's go back to the mechanism for authentication that you want to use, which is open with probably EAP authentication or not. So in that SSID, I'm just going to say no special EAP. I'm just going to do open. And of course, if you use EAP servers, you can decide where you want to do the authentication. You can define the authentication servers there. If you don't have defined it yet, you just click Define Default, and it's going to actually jump to the Server Manager page where you'll be able to define your Radius server. So for example, let's do it. Let's create one Radius here. It's IPv4. I'm going to give you the name. It's going to be my ICE server, for example. And the IP address is here, and I have to define a shared secret on the access points. Authentication ports, be careful, you have to define those because by default it's going to be 1645 and 1646, which are old ports. So make sure you replace them with the newer 1812 and 1813 ports that have been defined as being the Radius server ports for most deployments. All right, so that's the access point side. You can also use, if you want, the access point itself as its own Radius server. It's had its own tiny Radius. If you do so, it's kind of strange, but you also have to define the access point IP address as one of the Radius servers that you want to use. So here you are kind of the client side, the authenticator side, and you just define the Radius server IP addresses. So you can use ICE, which is outside. You can use the access point IP address, which is inside, but it's still one Radius you want to define on that page. Same, ports 1812, 1813 apply. Now that you have these two servers, what you must do is define the default. Which one should you use? If you have more than one, actually even if you have one, it's nice to point to it. But if you have more than one, you must define which one you want to use for EAP authentication by default. And then of course, if you use MAC authentication or counting or admin authentication, you can also point to other servers. But for us, it's EAP authentication and we're pointing by default to the ICE server, which doesn't prevent us from overriding this default in the SSID, but at least there is one default that we can point to if nothing is defined elsewhere. And if you use the local access point as a Radius server, there is this local Radius server page that you can jump to. And this is the other side. On the server manager, you were on the authenticator side, pointing to Radius servers, and one of them happened to be your same IP address. It was the access point. Here you jump to the authentication server side. And basically, you have to ignore the fact that it's one single box. You have to define everything as if it was an independent Radius server. So at the top, you see the schemes that this server is supporting. It's kind of limited, right? The AP can only do EAP fast, LEAP, and MAC authentication, no PEEP, no TLS, etc. But if you have those schemes, you can use the AP as a Radius server. And if you do so, your next step is to define which clients are allowed to query that Radius server. And although it's the same access point, you have here as well to allow the access point itself to be its own client. So you have to enter the IP address of the access point, the same shared secret you define on the server manager page, and then click apply. You can also define some other access point in the network that would be able to use that access point as a Radius server. And that's why you have this requirement to define who is querying this AP, because it might be the AP itself, but it can be somebody else. All right, so you have the AP here. Once you have that, you can also define the users on that Radius server. So let's create one username, try, put a password, confirm the password. And actually it can be more complicated than that. You can create some groups and you can associate groups to specific SSIDs. So some users only have the right to associate to some SSIDs, etc. Let's keep it. Let's just create one single user. Okay, so now I have my authentication scheme defined. Now that I have it, the next step is to configure the rest of the SSID. So let's go back to the SSID manager.